So just a bit of context setting for this session. I think most of us in the region will have heard the word innovation or create tech that's kind of being bandied around quite a lot at the moment. And we thought, actually, what does that mean for the cultural sector? How does that relate to the work that we do? And then the fantastic Eliza Easton has done a paper working with theatres and the National Theatre specifically, and Sarah, who's on the call from the RSC as well, I think has definitely been involved in this work. And has done a paper called Theatre Transformed, which is harnessing research, development, innovation. And I think that was exploring how how the theatre and investment innovation can support economic growth and greater social impact in the theatre sector. Well, Eliza's obviously got a huge amount of expertise around how that works across the wider cultural sector. So we just thought this was really, really exciting and interesting for us all to share and talk about and think about, especially ahead of our summit, which is in March, which many of you I know are registered, which is in partnership with the RSC, to kind of think about, we'll be thinking about systems thinking and design thinking and innovation in that space as well. So great context setting. Eliza, I'm just going to hand straight over to you, if that's okay. Thank you so much for being with us. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much, Erica. And hi, everyone. Nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well. I'm just going to share my screen. We tested this, but let's hope it works. Great. That looks like, can everyone see that? So yes, I'm Eliza. I run a small think tank called Erskine Analysis, and our focus is on the creative industries and soft power. And before that, I was Deputy Director of the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre, where I was for 5 years, and at Nesta before that. So my background is really in researching the creative industries as a whole, and often thinking and writing about culture in particular. But today I'm going to be talking about innovation as infrastructure. And as Erica mentioned, I suppose this is building on a piece of work called Theatre Transformed, which was just published by the National Theatre just before my maternity leave, actually. So I think I presented it about 3 days before I had my daughter, who's now downstairs with people, I promise. But it's, I think, a really timely piece of work because it feels to me like there's an enormous opportunity around innovation at the moment. And apologies for the quite busy slide. I'm really happy to share these afterwards as well, so people can kind of read them properly. But that opportunity isn't necessarily cultural or creative industries specific. The government has very much set out that innovation is one of the key ways, and perhaps the key way, that they're looking to achieve growth. They recently published some analysis which showed that for every £1 of public money spent on research and development, they were generating £8 in net economic benefit. And the government doesn't do analysis like that or publish analysis like that unless it's an area they want to invest in and are convinced is a good thing. And not just for growing the economy, but they're also recognising increasingly that spending money on innovation can have benefits when it comes to areas like health and security, the environment and quality of life. Now, the cultural sector in the UK is quite clearly a sort of truly globally leading sector. I always laugh because I think in so many areas of the economy, they talk about themselves as globally leading. I actually think it's quite hard to make the case for that in many areas of the UK economy. But actually, culture is one where we really can demonstrate that we're doing really exciting things artistically, that culture has really been ambitious in terms of social change, and that it has this huge economic benefit as well. And so, just marrying those two facts together, the government wants to invest in innovation to grow critical sectors, and we've got this amazing cultural sector, makes sense. There's a massive opportunity when it comes to research, development, and innovation. There are also some specific opportunities which people on this call may be aware of. The UK government recently announced a kind of record £500 million package for creative industries, research, development, and innovation. It's always possible to become a little bit skeptical. I hope that I won't get in trouble for saying this, but when there's investment in areas that's kind of portrayed as new, it's often other areas of investment sort of being wrapped up into a nice bow. But whether or not all of this £500 million was invested for the first time the other day, it's certainly the case that, within the last sort of decade that I've been working on creative industries investment, we have seen a really steep sort of incline in terms of the level of investment that they're looking to make in research and development in the creative industries. And so breaking this down, the government has committed to basically encouraging their arm's length body, UKRI, and specifically the Arts and Humanities Research Council and Innovate UK. People on the call may know this, but UKRI, the kind of government arm for R&D investment, has lots of different research councils, all of which in theory can invest in the creative industries. You know, if you're thinking about natural sciences, it may be that it's about materials and how they're used in film. But the biggest investors are the Arts and Humanities Research Council and Innovate UK, who invest in businesses as opposed to sort of academic research. But it will mobilise the whole UKRI system. They're going to be expanding the Creative Clusters programme, which has now existed for some time. They want to invest in a new creative content exchange, which is really about kind of thinking laterally about how we redesign an online marketplace in a world of artificial intelligence, very early stages. And then CoStar, which is an investment in mostly the screen industries. Performance is in there as well, and we'll come back to that. But is about a sort of significant around £75 million investment in the screen industries. They also are investing 25 million in what was called Creative Futures and now Createch Futures, in new creative economy infrastructure, including DISCO, which is a great name, and distributed system of scientific collections. And they want to provide greater policy clarity on how creative industries can use the existing R&D tax credits. And so the cultural sector, as we know, is very innovation rich. I'm sure everyone on this call can speak about the type of innovation already happening in the sector. And yet at the moment it's kind of underinvested. There are these obvious opportunities, which I've just highlighted, but I think there are kind of two key challenges, which are meaning that even given this desire to invest more in R&D overall in the economy and the specific investments which are happening in the creative industries, there's a likelihood that the cultural sector may still end up being underinvested after these investments take place. And so the first one of these sounds very nerdy, it's definitions, but I think is really critical to kind of unpicking why it is that this extraordinary sector hasn't had the level of investment from central government in innovation that it might otherwise have had. So there isn't actually a singular agreed definition of R&D and innovation. These are words which have been used for a long time, especially innovation, and are used in different contexts. And by different people to mean very different things. And even within the context of the UK government, there's not a singular definition of either R&D, which might seem more technical, or innovation. So UKRI has this quite nice broad definition, which is the creation and application of new knowledge to improve the world. Whilst it is broad, there's sort of something hidden within it. That desire to improve the world often means that you're showing ways in which the investment is kind of transformative, either in terms of economic impact, social impact. So it has that kind of impact focus in it. HMRC, for the purpose of tax, has quite a narrow and specific definition of R&D that they use, which focuses on advances in science and tech very particularly. So lots of the things that we might call innovation elsewhere wouldn't be included. And then there's a sort of broad international definition, which a lot of these relate to in the Frascati manual, which talks about the creative and systematic work undertaken in order to increase the stock of knowledge. So yeah, very knowledge based, and a lot of the other ones kind of respond to that, including the tax definition. In culture, innovation is used and R&D used extremely broadly. And I was lucky that when I started working on this piece of research, Theatre Transformed for the National Theatre, a book had come out from the theatre sector looking at R&D from theatre's perspective. And the ways in which that word was used were extremely broad. So it could mean rehearsal. It could mean sort of something very philosophical. It was all encompassing, and it was used often in the sector. So it might be about dreaming up a new theatrical show, but it could also be very particular, like deploying new technology. It covered artistic processes. It really ran the whole gamut. And I think here what you have is kind of two people speaking two different languages, and it's often led to confusion. We are doing loads of innovation. Why isn't it that the government doesn't want to invest? Well, it depends what definition they're using, what definition the sector's using. I actually think that often the government has come, they're behind the scenes perhaps can be a feeling that the sector doesn't understand what innovation is. I would say it's much more that there are multiple definitions and they're using different definitions. It's not about not understanding. There's not a singular correct definition. But if you're speaking across purposes, you're never going to be able to agree to sort of, increase a level of spend if you don't know what that spend is going to be on. And so in the paper, the solution that kind of I used, it's not the only one, was to kind of meet policy makers where they are, but continue to develop your own story in terms of what innovation could be. So in that paper, partly because there were some very specific immediate opportunities when it came to government policy, we talked about the creation and application of new knowledge to improve the world, which is in line with that broad definition that's used by the kind of UKRI, the government's main arm in terms of R&D investment. And we also focused on activity that's new to market rather than new to organisation, which is again what the government tends to be interested in investing in, and UKRI does. That means that broadly, although there were exceptions in the paper, we weren't looking at a theatre using a really interesting piece of AI tech for the first time. It would be about things that were brand new to the whole market and being done for the first time in that theatre, as opposed to being used by a certain theatre for the first time, albeit that might be innovation within that theatre. They're sort of interested in innovation across the board. And then we built on a lot of previous research to try and identify the different types of theatre innovation. And I also consulted with every department in the National Theatre and a number of commercial producers to kind of test these and see if this is how innovation was taking place. My view was that if we could demonstrate that not only was theatre doing some innovation, but actually there was a really strong sense of where the innovation was happening, what type, that funders would be more confident in giving money to those innovation activities. So we split it into these 5. There are actually 6, and we boiled it down to 5. Artistic innovation, I think broadly speaks for itself. It's kind of the core type of innovation which happens in the arts. Audience engagement innovation, changes in the way that organisations interact with the audience. Technical innovation. So this is very much in line with that kind of that definition set out by the HMRC. It's really about science and tech and how they're being used. Organizational innovation, so the way that the organization is structured. And finally, research. Now, all of these interact all the time, and a singular innovation activity might encompass, I'd say often 2, sometimes 3 of these. But they also can interact in different ways. So I think they can be segregated out. And then we went through and presented a kind of taxonomy showing that all 5 types of those are embedded throughout the production cycle. So this is a summary of it, nicely coloured summary. But we went through from kind of idea innovation, where you can see in terms of types of artistic innovation, you have new forms, immersive approaches. In terms of technical innovation, you might have people trying really early on to use AI and combine it with, build their own AI to come up with new forms of idea generation, as some theatres have done, new approaches to binaural sound. They might be building or using digital archives. And then in research, we have really lovely examples in the paper of people basically doing incredibly impactful, sometimes on a politically impactful research to inform the stuff that they're writing for theatre. On to development, you have new types of artistic innovation that happen at the workshopping stage. You might have audience engagement innovation at this type with, different ways that they might interact with the audiences that are developing it. technical innovation in terms of new stage tech, which is developed. So we went through every stage, providing examples and really boiling down exactly what was happening. And I think my real ambition was to get policymakers in particular and funders to feel really confident that they understand the type of innovation that theatres do, and also demonstrate how rich it is already in terms of innovation activity, almost none of which is funded outside of kind of government grants through the Arts Council. So none of which is funded through innovation funding, accepting that kind of grant and aid. We also looked outside the artistic cycle, so to areas like digital marketing and audience development, ticketing and audience experience, fundraising, business models, archives, accessibility, sustainability, and education and skills. Again, this is just within theatre, but these are so rich in terms of innovation which is happening on a day-to-day basis, both in commercial and publicly funded theatre. And again, I think goes completely broadly unacknowledged. But if you think about, for example, the ways in which theatres have been pioneering AI chatbots, they've been thinking about predictive analytics, the type of equipment they've been building. Actually, these are almost the most classic examples of R&D that the government completely understand. And then we need to build out from that and say, all these other types of innovation are happening as well. But I think I need to sort of stop slightly and say, whilst for practical reasons, it makes sense to say to the government, even within your own definitions, arts and cultural organisations are already doing huge amounts of innovation and are ready to be funded to do more of that to drive growth and social impact. I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it's important for the sector to have an idea of innovation that works for itself as well. So we don't need to completely subscribe to sort of the government definitions. And I think there's been lots of people, including the Royal Shakespeare Company, who are obviously on the call. And I think Sarah's going to briefly touch on the work they've been doing with their fellowship programme later. The Serpentine, the Arts Council, and Nesta, where I was previously, who in different ways have been saying, actually, let's also try to change some of the definitions which are being used. Let's try to make them make more sense for arts and cultural sectors, specifically when it comes to tax, but more broadly when it comes to the type of innovation and the form of innovation that's funded. So I think the sector, in terms of really capitalizing on the opportunities that are sitting there right now, has to do both things. Understand where the government's coming from and why, what's driving them. I think we need to be empathetic to some of the drivers which mean they have this tight focus on very particular types of R&D and innovation, and recognise the sector can absolutely find areas where they're doing those things and get funding for them now, but then also continue to push the bounds wherever possible of what innovation might look like, the types of things different funders might want to support. So really about meeting people where they are, but continue to dream big in terms of what innovation can be for the sector. So the second challenge, which I wanted to kind of point to in terms of maximising the benefits of these opportunities which sit on the table, is policy oversight. So over the past decade, you've seen, I've spoken about how R&D investment in the creative industries has been transformed. We've seen significant increases in the level of investment. But when you start looking at the cultural sector, and obviously my research looked at theatre in particular, you see how really it's still sort of a drop in the ocean compared to the opportunity that might be there. So only the Royal Shakespeare Company is an independent research organisation, a status which demonstrates the richness of the innovation work they do and their research, and also enables them to get lots of different kinds of funding and opportunities that other organisations don't have as a result of being able to demonstrate how qualified they are. And I think really interestingly, when you look at UKRI funded projects on theatre, only 1% of those actually involved a theatre. Were led by a theatre, and just around 10% had a theatre involved. So whilst it absolutely makes sense that there'd be some academic research, even very highly funded academic research, which would be about theatre, which wouldn't involve a theatre, I think that is astonishingly low to imagine that actually quite a lot of research is happening about theatre. And I imagine the same is true for every part of the cultural sector. And a relatively small amount involves them, even as an unpaid project partner, let alone as someone who's receiving funding to do that. R&D tax relief is also really rarely used in the cultural sector. That's in part because it focuses on scientific and technical advances. So artistic R&D and many of the other types of R&D that I mentioned are excluded, and that doesn't look to change anytime soon. But also it's actually quite complicated in terms of how it aligns with some of the other incentives. And so, for example, in my research, I realised that the way that R&D tax works means that anything that qualifies for it instantly doesn't qualify for other creative industries tax incentives, which are more generous. So in theory, it's actually would be less lucrative to be doing R&D than it would be to do other types of theatrical production investment. That's obviously not the incentive the government wants. It's just a mismatch of how the tax incentives are working with one another. But it's no wonder that the sector is getting itself confused about it. And it's also no wonder that these incentives are really not very often used. In fact, I think I can only name a couple of organisations, or maybe only one, certainly one, that have used them successfully. There has been some guidance now published on the tax incentives, but still it doesn't clarify exactly how they sit alongside other creative industries tax incentives, and it's still pretty narrow. And then the government has got a load of activity that's been introduced to support technology diffusion in the small business strategy, in the tech adoption review, in tech first training. There's been very limited outreach to the cultural sector. They're not designed with the cultural sector in mind, but the sector absolutely needs these things. I think there's another part of the kind of solution as well. Sorry, that's the challenge. In terms of the solutions, I think there's two parts. So the first is finding areas of innovation potential which immediately meet the needs of multiple stakeholders, including policymakers. So if policymakers can see opportunities to invest in innovation in the sector that meets their needs as well as the sector's needs, they're obviously going to be more incentivized to do that. Very busy slide. But in essence, in the paper, we approach this by looking across kind of 4 different drivers of innovation. What is it that's driving innovation for audiences, in the sector itself, in terms of new technologies and policy? So to give a few examples, in terms of audiences, we know that younger audiences are increasingly engaged, more diverse, urban, digitally connected. There are challenges in terms of older audiences in theatres. There's a strong public expectation for theatres to lead on inclusion, fair access and environment. There's a difficulty specifically in terms of frequency of attendance, but lots of first-time bookers. So you can see some of the things that might be driving innovation in terms of audiences. Then across the theatre sector, huge financial pressures and cost inflation need to drive innovation, but also a want to develop new forms and genres, supply chain convergence. Again, this is really distilling some of the key drivers that are shaping innovation in each of these categories. And then tech, it's really easy to focus exclusively on AI, but we've also got things like immersive, robotics, synthetic biology, interactive tech, which have the capability to change how theatre happens. And finally, policy. What is it that the government wants to achieve? Well, they want to kickstart economic growth, they want health benefits, they want to break down barriers to opportunity, and they want Britain to be a clean energy superpower. How do these things play in to the type of innovation that might get funded by the government in the near term? And so again, in the paper, we started to kind of bring those together and think about what would be sort of big ideas for innovation projects, which meet the need of 3 or 4 of those different parts of the kind of driver matrix. And that included an idea around marketing, audience insight and engagement, an idea around new genres and forms, an idea around theatre tech, around materials and reuse, and then in terms of reaching a global marketplace. And if you'd like to read more about those, they're obviously in more detail in the report itself. But I think there's another part of the solution as well, which is engaging directly with the government and with arm's length bodies to really articulate what the sector needs and wants. So in the report, we give another number of recommendations. And these are all about sort of embedding, the government needs to embed the arts in innovation policy, they need to clarify tax incentives, they need to support adoption, all the things we've been talking about. UKRI need to recognise theatre as a driver of innovation, or the cultural sector more broadly, and invest in new systematic R&D programmes, and to support participation in new interdisciplinary initiatives. But I also think it's important to say that the sector itself needs to engage with those bodies. And so when we're talking about CoStar, for example, a major investment which includes performance in it, the sector also needs to approach those running it and UKRI to really become part of that, as well as the other way around. So in the paper, it's not just recommendations for the government and UKRI, but also for the sector to go to those places and engage in those conversations about what these kind of mega investments look like and how culture can play a part. One opportunity is around the Creative Clusters programme. And in the paper, we talk about the idea for the sector developing a bid for a performing arts cluster. And so much of the work UKRI does is kind of done on that basis. The sector itself needs to, or people from the sector need to approach the UKRI or the government. It can't always be the other way around. The same with IRO status. The Royal Shakespeare Company has IRO status because it worked for it and applied for it. And there's an opportunity for other organisations to do the same if they want to make this a priority. I think future research is also really important, and it's so exciting to see kind of the work that's being done by organisations like the Serpentine in visual arts, the British Council, and actually work which is still to come out by Arts Council England, but which I've had a kind of preview of, although it may have changed significantly since then, which think about innovation and R&D and really build a rich understanding of what it means for the sector and how that relates to these big policy opportunities. And as I mentioned, I don't think we need to be constrained only by immediate political opportunity. We need to evolve definitions of R&D for the arts. We need to demonstrate what exciting frontiers of R&D of the arts might mean. And so I will share this, but after, so people can have a look at these links. But there's just a few examples, including our paper, of some of the exciting work which is happening, giving different perspectives on creative R&D and innovation. And 3 examples which I've mentioned, the Clusters Programme, CoStar, and the work the RSC is doing in terms of examples of R&D kind of in action right now. I wondered, given that I'd mentioned the RSC a few times and Sarah's on the call, whether she might talk a little bit about the kind of work they're doing, which is really, I'd say, at the frontier of imagining what research and development in arts and cultural organisations might look like. And then I'd be really happy to take any questions and hopefully have a bit of a discussion about this area of policy. Thanks.
Hello. That was awesome, Eliza. I'm terrible at Zoom and calls, which is ironic given my job title. But I hope you can hear me and see me okay. Eliza, that was amazing. And just to say how important it is to have people in your role and position speaking to those parts of our infrastructure and our sector, if you know what I mean, where the sector is not always having to do that heavy lift of translation and connection to policy and government. It's really important, and it's lovely to see actually the wealth and diversity of practice and work in the macro view. Often we're doing our day-to-day jobs, heads down, working really hard, and we don't often get to see that macro view, and that's really important and massively helpful to us when we're setting our narratives actually, and setting the tone of what our future is, and defining that and seeing what our options are. I suppose it's when I was listening to Eliza, what I was thinking about is what would be useful to share in this moment with this group. And some of it I felt about the practicalities of it, and sort of like the translation back between how we talk about it at a policy level and then what that looks like and what that feels like when you're on the ground in the sense delivering. And so I hope I've sort of got a couple of takeaways as well, and also to talk about the why we've done what we've done at the RSC over the last few years to help that make sense. I'm often in so many rooms, whether I'm in the arts or whether I'm in innovation or tech or whatever those rooms are, and I'm in a perpetual state of translation. And I think that's an important thing to think about when we do this work, is how do we move from that state of defining what we do in the arts to people knowing what we do in the arts and seeing that on a level with us and seeing that with each other. I've worked at the RSC for about 15 years, but the connection with UKRI came around about 10 years ago. And one note to say is that these relationships and bids and large scale pieces of work often take a lot longer to set up, to forge those meaningful relationships with academics and technology partners. And the best projects I've done are projects with those people that I have had really long-standing relationships with, that have a shared objective, that know why they're brought into it. And so the thing I wanted to share is know your strengths and like yourself for your weaknesses. Actually, we don't need to know everything about technology. We don't need to know everything about innovation. We don't need to be able to analyze ourselves through an academic lens. We can work with others that help us do that, but that shared objective is really important. And so when we look at innovation, it's actually changed over the last 10 years. I'd say 10 years ago, I was looking at tools and technologies that were coming into the theatre making toolkit that was helping us to be better, faster, brighter, and have more impact. Now the lens that we're looking at, particularly through the interdisciplinary programme that we've been working on, is the validity and why artists matter. And that if we are going to get through the next 10 years, we are going to have to imagine ourselves out of the many crises that we face. And arts and culture is absolutely essential to that, as a political debate, as an infrastructural debate, and absolutely essential to being the beating heart of what people, how people come to those shared challenges. So innovation isn't always just a one-size-fits-all piece of work. It's fluid and it responds to the moment you're in. And how we look at innovation has myriad definitions and translations. But what it's there to do is to take us out of our business as usual, take us out of our everyday and look at change. And look at the change mechanism of where we were when we started and then where do we want to get to. And we can look at that over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I find it's often more comfortable in this moment to look at the next 20 because the next 5 seem really hard. And I just want to say that out loud, that often we can look at a speculative future in a lot easier way than looking at an immediate future. But actually, I think some of the change does need to happen more quickly. And so how do we look at these opportunities around innovation in these large-scale projects, both in the short, medium and long term, are really important because we have to bring our stakeholders with us. So we are an independent research organisation. We applied, I think, in 2017, and it took quite a long time to set up, and particularly with the pandemic. And it's not an easy thing to apply for or achieve. There's a lot of process in what you have to do before that point to be eligible for that status. And so the work we had done with UKRI was evidential of that. And the work that UKRI is doing often doesn't involve the word culture or doesn't involve the word the arts. So really, it's looking at very specific outcomes around growth, very specific outcomes around impact. And when we make a piece of work, that's not always a comfortable fit or where we want to be. So having projects that are adjacent to your business as usual is often quite important. On a practical note, with the R&D tax relief, we, just in full transparency, we've applied twice for the R&D tax relief. One was successful and one wasn't. And in that, just to be clear, theatre tax relief has been hugely beneficial. We couldn't have got through the past few years without theatre tax relief. But R&D tax relief does work slightly differently, and it's funding risk. So it is looking at things that have not been done before and you proving that in quite granular detail. So when you look at R&D tax relief, it's really worth looking at those parameters and guidelines at the beginning of any process to be set up for the evidence that you require. Again, when we look at innovation, our worlds in the arts and culture sector are used to writing in a certain way about our work, and these are different audiences. So thinking about the different audiences and what their priorities are is super important. I'm sounding very nuts and bolts right now, but I hope it's helpful in the context of us actually doing this work, you know what I mean, and doing this work together and having someone practical going, that was great, that was bad, but that was helpful and I've learned this. So setting up the systems in advance, and also that in these projects, they want to see real world outcomes. So that's where the arts can really thrive. So placing a piece of innovation, for example, we did some R&D with our video designer, Ikhila Krishnan, on the BFG. They went outside their business as usual practice and converged lighting and sound technologies around motion capture and looked at it in a completely new way and created a new technology pipeline. That doesn't sound sexy at all if you're looking at marketing that to audiences, but that went into the show, and the BFG was a real world example and application of that innovation. So my point is that you can do something adjacent and on the side and then add it in, or you can create projects that are completely about innovation and how that's created. But the R&D risk in that was we hadn't looked at that could have failed. It could have not been added in, but it still had a validity. So there's a very strange connection with failure in innovation. And a lot of people go, failure's great. I can tell you it doesn't feel great when you're experiencing it. So my point is to think about how you look after yourself around setting things up that are successful and failure, and what does success look like, and what is a safe form of failure in a process, and that's important. The work we're doing at the moment around artist-led R&D is to place artists in spaces where they have a series of fellowships that we are offering artists from around the world, and paying for their time to take them out of their business as usual and everyday practice, and have that space for them to imagine and look at a research question that they can explore, that then can play back to us, and we can start mapping what the genuine art psychology is looking like, what those questions are for those artists, and what we are finding and surfacing, and then how that artist-led R&D can feed back into other cross-industry challenges. Some of that you will not be surprised to hear is around AI. A lot of that is around well-being. A lot of that is around design systems, real practical challenges that artists face alongside technological innovation. And what we're doing through this work is creating a repository of evidence that then we can work with, that can set up a sustainable model where artists also have a diverse ecosystem for their work and their practice, and they're not just looking at new forms of economic value to them and for them and potential work, but also creating a space for artists not to be in a perpetual state of production, not to be in a perpetual state of performative work around institutional thinking. So it is not institutionally led, it is actually artistically led. and that we are gathering that evidence and data to then allow us to look at the big questions that arts and culture face alongside innovation, and then create frameworks for that to appear and happen. So it's quite bold and it's quite different, and also it is setting aside, it's a separate track to what I would call our everyday production schedule, because what happens is when you go into production, you have so many challenges around time, making it work, bringing it together. We need to give time and space to ourselves, our industry. And when I say artist, I'm looking at administrators, I'm looking at producers, I'm looking at fundraisers. You are all part of the arts ecology, and that inclusive environment is really important. So when we fund risk, we are not just funding a project. I hope in the future we will fund portfolios of work that allow us to look at risk in a much more nuanced way, and also create evidence around arts and culture being an absolutely fundamental part of how we innovate biotech, how we innovate AI systems, how we innovate different industries that are in a state of change and innovation. And I'll just go back to a final note, if that's all right, which is I can't ever find, whenever I'm looking at whatever's coming through or anything like that, I've never ever been able to get away from this sentence, and this is always my starting point, is people ask, oh, is theatre dead? Are we done with theatre? And I would say in this generation now, I have not yet found a better storytelling technology than the live actor. And in addition to that, when we look at AI, I cannot find a better form of connection around believability and how you play with the rules of believability than a connection between a live performer and an audience. And if we start there, we can really innovate and look at these challenges in completely new ways. And we need the Elizas, we need the government, we need, do you know what I mean? We need all of that to collectively talk about that. And then we need to look at, again, it won't be everyone doing everything all at once in the same way. It's find your strength, know what that is, and then work with infrastructures around you that don't forget the promise of what you do. I think that's it. Is that all right? I'm really sorry. Like, is that, I've got no idea.
Sold. Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Eliza. Thanks, Sarah, so much. Do you know what? It was just really lovely actually to, like, as well, you've summed it all up, Sarah, like actually to hear sort of the policy, but also the practice, and to think about how that actually relates to what's going to, or what is happening here in the region. And, you know, just as both of you were talking, I was just reflecting a bit on kind of the bits that I've done, and I know lots of other people in this room have done. And, you know, I was just like, hold on, like I was doing, like I was an ESRC researcher at one point, like working with a theatre company with Stan's Caff actually. And you kind of go, this work is happening in so many places and in really exciting ways. But yeah, the language and sort of the speak of it, I guess, is kind of where there's a bit of a mismatch sometimes. But already, you know, just from this conversation, I was just thinking about all of the ways that this starts to connect up to the practice that is actually happening in the region. And I just love that kind of challenge about how we imagine ourselves out of the crisis. It makes kind of this topic of innovation and R&D and all of this kind of very technical language feel quite real and quite pertinent to what we're all doing now. We've got 15 minutes for some questions, and I don't want to take up too much time. So if people want to put their hands up or shout out any questions or reflections, I'd love to hear from all of you. I know there's some great people in the room today.
Can I just quickly say something on this really briefly, just to add to what Sarah said? I think that the thing that Sarah said, which really is just so true and not said enough, is that failing, yeah, everyone says failing's great, failing doesn't feel great. And I think failure is even harder when there's not been that much investment in an area. I think that the creative industries, it's been so limited in terms of, even in the industry side, the level of investment that's happened, that every failure is focused on so strongly, and it's like every single thing has to be a success. And my dream would be to get to a place where there's a level of investment where you can have your failures and it's not sort of seen as bringing down the entire sector because something didn't work, because we need things to not work. That is the level of risk that we should be investing at. So I just thought that was really well said by Sarah.
Definitely amazing. Rachel, sorry, I can see you've got your hand up as well. Sorry, you dropped a message in the chat there.
I couldn't see where to put my hand up. So, thanks so much for that, Eliza. Really fascinating. I followed your work a little bit, and Sarah, to kind of give that overview. Thank you. I've written loads of notes. I'm trying to distill it into something that's actually a question and not just loads of comments. But I suppose what's really stood out to me was this idea that you spoke about of how is kind of policy and funding and the UKRI coming together, and then where is arts and culture also coming to meet it. And actually that's what's happened really rapidly in the last few years, isn't it? These two ecosystems have suddenly really overlapped. And for context, I've worked on some creative cluster programs and things like that. And, we're now seeing UKRI funding freelancers. We're seeing Innovate UK fund basically, theatre companies and things just out of nowhere. So there's this sudden real rapid shift that's had to happen. And all of the things that you've described in terms of, the language, the definitions, the underlying drivers around growth and commercialization and all that kind of stuff are really new to parts of those ecosystems. And that, from my experience, it's, Sarah spoke about it being a slow process. It kind of is just inevitable, isn't it? Because you've just got this exposure of different people that can only take time. There's no paper, no secret thing that's going to happen, and overnight all these people are going to be working in exactly the same way. It's this slow coming together and exposure of different things, which is why I think, like you're saying, Anthony, these kinds of conversations are really important, are they, where we're bringing people together. And I think some of the things Sarah said about, you use lots of language like kind of nuts and bolts or sort of all the practicalities, but actually it is that sort of stuff. Like my experience of working with smaller arts organisations or creative freelancers, they are doing innovation, but it's some tiny little thing that they're doing as part of a bigger project, which absolutely the technology company wouldn't do themselves. They maybe would think they would, but they don't. They need that creative vision to make that thing happen. And it's something really small, but it's special. And often the kind of work I've done is sort of sitting alongside them to say, I don't think you realise that this could have a big impact. This would be of interest or relevance to other people, but it's probably not the part of it that you're actually that interested in, because you're interested in the kind of creative output or whatever. So I think there's a lot of that sort of side of it, a lot around kind of business development. You spoke at the beginning of it being about often driven by growth and commercialization, which can be problematic in the creative sector. But actually, if that's the kind of underlying, do people have the sort of business skills to think about their work in that way, to articulate it in that way? And again, I was on a call recently where someone kind of said, oh, we just want to focus on innovation. We don't want to do the kind of boring, generic business skills stuff. And I was thinking, no, we do still, I'm paraphrase that, but it kind of was what was being said. And it's actually, no, they have to go together, because people don't see that innovation if they've not got the kind of basic tools to think, how are they reaching new stakeholders, new markets? How are they turning that into a product? So I've not asked a question there, have I? I've just made loads of comments. But I suppose the kind of thought of the question really is where you see that in your work, Eliza. Obviously you're focused on working with some bigger organisations, but in terms of the kind of day-to-day practice of artists and freelancers, are you also seeing a shift, or do they feel even further away from that ecosystem?
I think it's a great question, and also just really interesting points. Absolutely, the movement is happening, but I think Sarah was right in that people who seem, like RSE probably from the outside seems incredibly embedded in the kind of UKRI infrastructure. That is as a result of a lot of long-term hard work, lots of conversations, understanding what the kind of mutual priorities are. And that's really hard for individuals to do and freelancers to do. So where it's possible to have organizations that are able to kind of, look like the RSE for the sector, able to kind of be those front runners for the sector, speaking not just on its own behalf, but more broadly. I think that's very powerful. But I would love ways, and I think there have been moments where HRC in particular have tried to think about ways to get individuals more involved in the process of kind of thinking about what the next innovation frontiers might be, what innovation looks like for freelancers. There was an idea which kind of got progressed and now might not happen, and I think there have been a few others. But I hope we get to that point, because at the moment, I think an organisation needs to have quite a lot of capacity and certainly a lot of investment to get to a point where they're really able to maximise the opportunities at the political level. I also think there's a point of organisations saying we want to do this type of innovation, that's not something that this funder is particularly prioritising. It doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. Like, of course they should do it. It just means they shouldn't be getting that fund. They're not going to get, however hard they work, however brilliant they are, they're not going to get their funding from that funder because they have particular priorities. So I'd say that's another sort of important thing to know from the beginning. This thing isn't going to be funded through this route. Let's think again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lavernia, I can see you've got your hand raised, and Mia will come on to you afterwards as well.
Thank you. So, what an important presentation. I'm so glad I'm here today. I want to thank you both so much. Quite astounding, and my mind is blown. It was really useful, Eliza, to hear this kind of the drill down analysis. It's just got me thinking on so many different kind of points and perspectives. My background, my business, if you like, is kind of education, and from an education perspective, and some things that chimed from both presentations, why artists matter, and from an education perspective, we are producing, or part of the HEIs are producing the pipeline of artists and thinkers and scientists, etc., as an infrastructure for the culture. So some of the things that you were pointing out helped me to kind of frame the importance, if you like, of where education sits, or the pipeline, the production of students, if you like, to feed the culture, to feed the ecosystem, and how that's kind of framed. And as you were talking about these different definitions of R&D, there's a STEAM agenda, sort of engineering and arts, and what that actually means. And I get terribly excited about it, because quite often the definition of STEAM isn't just interdisciplinary. The actual definition of STEAM is where you have technology and art interfused to make something we don't know yet. It's absolutely sits on the line of the creative, febrile, creative kind of zone, essence, whatever. So I think the kind of the taxonomy that you referenced is a really interesting framing to perhaps look at STEAM, what STEAM can do in terms of all the things that you kind of outlining. I don't know what it means. I might be sort of drilling too macro into this. I've got no idea of what it looks like, but it's dinging in my mind. It's sparked me. It's given me that opportunity for that thought. And the notion of drawing the government near, I think, is a really important point that I'll take away from that, and see how one can inveigle themselves into that kind of conversation. One thing, Sarah, I think, absolutely agree with all the points that you were making. And something that also chimed with me is this notion of time. And there seems to be a conversation around the slowness of research, and the slowness of the space that slowness enables. And I think, not having the focus on production as well is quite innovative, and I quite like that. But I'm also reminded that slowness has different opportunities for different cultures and different responsibilities, and different people with at different stages in their lives and at different points in their culture, where slowness might be reflected in a completely different way. So creating spaces for slowness to exist, I think, with those kind of fellowship parameters, I think is very exciting. I also don't have a question. I'm just buzzing with excitement about all of these kind of aspects, really. And I can now think of the UKRI as having an intention to improve the world, and HMRC, which, in my self-employed days, frightened the life out of me, advancing science and technology, and somewhere in there, artists are everywhere and part of that ecosystem. So I have no question, just thanking you for the presentations, basically.
Well, I would have something to say back, which is I didn't maybe say this clearly enough in the presentation, but the paper really focuses on the theatre sector and kind of theatres in particular and theatre makers, but we point to the fact that there's a huge sort of wider sector around theatre, including educators. And I would love a similar paper which looked at innovation within that broader ecosystem. It was just that for this paper, we wanted to be so sort of detailed in terms of exactly the different types of innovation that felt too broad. In fact, we didn't even do performing arts. We just did theatre so we could try and get sort of as tight as possible to specific types of innovation and cover as many as possible that the sector would recognise in itself. But I would love to see, I know that's so it's innovation rich in that wider ecosystem as well, which we didn't touch on enough.
Sparking lots of project ideas and things to do here, which is always makes me a bit nervous, but also quite excited. Mia, I think we've got a question from you. Jonathan, did you have your hand up as well, or did I? We'll do Mia and then Jonathan, if we can do the question from you straight after as well. I'm very conscious we're going to go a couple of minutes after 10:30.
Oh, well, don't. I'm fine. I'm fine.
Okay. Mia, sorry.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really interesting. I don't know if you can hear and see me, but hopefully, yeah. Really interesting, absolutely fascinating. So I'm from One Dance UK, so we're the body representing the dance sector. So, and obviously dance goes into theatre, and I was just touching on what you've just said in terms of you've kept it to theatre because obviously I can see that because you've really got to make it. You want the depth, and if it was so broad, you potentially would lose that depth. But from I suppose the question from me, coming from One Dance, is how as a body representing dance and the dance sector, which does cover research in health and education, dance companies, universities, and young dancers and so forth, and creators and freelancers, is how we could participate in helping that whole dance sector realise the opportunity which is there for R&D, for innovation, for funding for R&D and innovation. Because the thing is whenever you speak about money with creatives, I'm not necessarily creative, so I come from that kind of money background. It impedes on their creativity, and it's very hard to think about money and being creative and innovative. But it's enhancing all of our artists to be able to create, imagine, because that's where the future is. That's what the whole arts sector can offer. They have the imagination, the creativity to have, amazing innovation, and it's how we can support them in terms of accessing that. And I think that's my question here is how can we hold them, lift them, support them in achieving that, and still give them the freedom to create and innovate and imagine.
So I'll try to answer really quickly. I'm going to build on what Sarah said. So the real sort of big investments, these things don't happen overnight. They're the result of long built relationships and often quite a lot of resource. And so there's an element by which it makes sense to think about what are the large scale organisations that have the most resource that want to commit to this area kind of long term and there to be big investments sort of under their steam. Those organisations offer one thing, which is building a relationship with UKRI, for example, really thinking in-house about the kind of innovation they want to do. And I think Sarah could probably do 3 more hours on it, and I would listen with great interest. But I think for other people who want to get involved, so one way is to think about what investments there are out there and to kind of keep track of those investments which are happening in innovation or conversations. So, for example, like the Serpentine conversation on R&D, I think they'd be really interested in a conversation with dance, with other parts of the sector, the British Council work on R&D, certainly the Arts Council work on R&D, make sure that dance is part of those sort of earlier conversations about what it means within the sector. And then I would also say to start bringing together like really strong case studies, those are often the best ways to speak to policymakers. And with a case study, you can sort of think very carefully about what is it that's going to be interesting to the policymaker, what is it that represents the sector correctly. So if you had some really strong R&D sort of case studies, I think that would allow you to start some of those conversations at a sector level. And then I would be thinking about individuals and individual organisations that might want to be kind of building capacity to have longer term significant investment in research and development. And, they're busy people, but people like Sarah who've done it in other parts of the sector, those are the most amazing sort of practical examples, and they can really talk to you about what it means to do kind of large scale, really ambitious research and development activity that does sort of get government funding, but also push the boundaries of what innovation can mean in the cultural sector.
Mia, there are some really strong examples from the dance sector, actually, of I find dance often more than even some other disciplines where dancers or dance companies have really pivoted and have got very different kind of approaches and business models now and tapping into different funding. So I can happily share you some examples if you're not aware of them. Sorry to interrupt, so that might be helpful for exactly the reason Eliza's just said, get that evidence out there and expose other dancers and other dance companies to that so they can see what other people are doing that might be a bit different.
Yeah, and we're talking to a lot of those, and
sorry, Mia, sorry to interrupt. Only because we've gone well over.
Fine.
And it feels like there's so much more to talk about as well. Just to pick up on Jonathan's comment as well. Thanks for sharing that about the importance of not being opportunistic about just funded opportunities. I think you can see that opportunism in both in funding applications, but also in academic projects and stuff as well. I think that point, Eliza, that you were talking to earlier about lots of theatres involved in R&D projects, but only was it 1% or something that had received the investment. So we see that tagging on of things quite often, and so that. Yeah, that really careful thinking through of why R&D is particularly important and the benefits that it has to people, to places, and to the sector. It feels like we've got a lot more that we need to cover, but I just want to say thank you to Eliza and to Sarah. Everyone's massively enthused, got loads of ideas and opportunities. So I think there's a bit of a challenge here for us at Culture Central, with everyone here in the room as well, to think a bit more about what we can be doing in this space to support everyone in the sector. So thank you for coming along. We'll put the recording up online, and we'll hope to see you at one of these crew sessions very soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Eliza. Thanks, Sarah. See you, everyone.